I'd worked around, and I didn't like the idea of going in and do the same job over and over again. So
That's after you hired in
after
permanently.
permanently, yeah.
And that was in the,
That was still in the motor plant.
okay. Who was
But
your foreman?
my first foreman, oh, yeah, I can't.
Or the superintendent?
The superintendent when I started was Church.
Is that Lou Church?
Yeah, Louis Church.
Okay.
And then I can't remember the procession of them exactly now.
That's okay.
Boy, names escape me anyway. Anyway, any job I was on, I'd tell them, well, you know, I'd rather be extra man in the department. They always kept an extra guy for absenteeism. So I always asked for that job, and most people didn't like that, working a different job every day. So I got that.
What kinds of jobs did you do?
Well, on hourly, now we're still on hourly, I had done nearly every job in the motor plant. That includes every job on the assembly line. And I started doing this, but the way I found out I kind of like to do this. After I got off sweeping, I wanted that extra 8 cents an hour, whatever it was that we got. Difference between sweeping and working on the assembly line. I needed that extra 8 cents an hour. I would trade jobs with the guy next to me. We'd switch around just to break the monotony of the thing, and then pretty soon I was switching with the second guy down and the third guy down and this and that and the other thing. So I soon learned how to do every job in my department.
Okay, now what were those jobs specifically?
Well, I started out putting on timing gears on the assembly line, assembling timing gears. And then another job I had that was a job that they needed an extra person for was what they called hanging rods, putting the piston rod assembly into the engine block. You had to have a bit of experience to do that. You just couldn't go in there and learn that job in 10 minutes. It took you a couple of days to get it that, and if you didn't do it properly, you caused damage to either the cylinder block or the piston assembly. And so everybody was happy to have an extra man that could do that job in case of absenteeism.
Do you remember how many engines that they were making an hour?
They were making about 80 an hour, as I recall, at that time. 8-cylinder. They just at that time that was the only V8 engine there was. It was, and I remember the air conditioned mix at that time. They were making about 10% air conditioners. Is all. And I had the foreman's name on the tip of my tongue. Anyway, eventually, and then being as extra man, I'd get loaned out to other departments. So eventually I got so that I went in and I never knew what, I become a relief man's extra man because I could do all the jobs in there. If they had a relief man off, they could get me because I could relieve all the jobs on the line, and there weren't many people who could do that. Then after that, right, yeah, just individual jobs, and so I never worked there on any one job. So then I got kind of tired of that, and here again I wanted more overtime, and the overtime was in the machine floor. So I transferred over into the cylinder block machine floor.
Still in 28?
Still in the same Kettering, they used to call it the Kettering engine plant. And so I went over to the block floor, and then I was a machine operator.
Now, what did you machine, and who was your foreman?
I machined cylinder blocks, and Garvey was my foreman for quite a while, but he was probably the longest time foreman I had.
About what time did you move over? 56, 57?
No, it was before that. Let's see, it would have been, I went on salary in 1960, I believe. And so it would have, and I think I had, it was about 54 or 5, I think, when I moved over there. And we had a big year, as I recall, they had a big year in 55. And then we had some slack years where they went down to that working 4 days a week and one thing and another. And then it wasn't back in 57, I think, then they went back and they had another another big year and working all kinds of overtime and this and that and the other thing. But I liked the overtime because I also had gotten married in 1953. And so had lots of reason to want overtime, you know. So that's one of the reasons why I moved over into the block floors so that I could work all this overtime, which I did work a good deal of overtime. In fact, that's another thing that I used to do is when we were working overtime, a lot of people didn't want to work overtime. They wanted to work overtime when it wasn't any overtime. But everybody got too much of it, is what I'm saying, and then they didn't want to work that. So I'd go around every day long on Thursday and Friday and kind of canvass the different foremen I knew in the motor plant and see if they wanted anybody to work on the weekends. So I ended up working a lot of overtime, even out of but as starting out as this extra man and one thing and another and learning all these jobs, I could do that. It wasn't like I didn't know what I was doing because I go in and I done the same thing when I got into the machining end of it. I'd do different jobs if I could. And I like to work that way better than just go in and do the same job every day. And,
remember some of the foremen that you'd be talking with?
well, Fred Hollingsworth, who lived just over here, and a guy named Starr. His first name was Starr, and I can't say his name. He was a good guy. We got along well. Bob Garvey, Fred Hollingsworth. I worked for him. Boy, I can't. The names really.
That's okay. Who was the superintendent?
Well, he was I can't remember. The assistant, whom I never got along well with, was the guy. You would know him. He built a sailboat in his garage, and then he took it over and put it on Lake Michigan. What the devil was? I never thought I'd forget that guy.
Probably would know the name, although I don't know the incident.
Yeah, I know it. It's, I just can't recall the name. Maybe it'll come to me as we go on.
Okay.
And Cordes, he was the general foreman at that time, Judd,
Okay.
and he kind of encouraged me to go on and go into. They just started the foreman school about this time, and he said, "Well, why don't you go in?" And he says, "I'll recommend that you go to this foreman school."
It was about 19.
Probably late 50s. And I said, well, yeah, I said, I'd like to do that. And of course, I'd had quite a talk with him. And I said, well, if I could do that, I would go into supervision. But I had enough experience to know, I said, well, I don't want to get dead-ended in a foremanship. If I go into supervision, it'll be my goal to go upwards in supervision rather than stay on. I said, I've got no interest in being a foreman the rest of my life. I said, I just soon work on hourly, where I'd had more freedom to move around than I would get stuck on a foremanship. So he said, no, if you go through the school, you'll have a better chance for promotion. So anyway, then in the meantime, Judd moved. He transferred. I think he went over into the sheet metal end of it, the business. And when it came time for my...
Who replaced him, do you remember?
Pardon?
Who replaced Cordes?
No, well, I'm just gonna, I can remember what the hourly people called him. They called him Jackie Gleason. And he had transferred from another area of the plant in there. And I don't know that I'll ever remember his name. But anyway, he and I didn't get along well. And so when it came to my interview, the recommendation that Judge Cordes had for me to go into this new foreman training program, we got to him, and I guess when I had the interview with him, because he and I didn't get along well, I never got into the foreman training program. No, I never got any explanation of why he didn't think I deserved it or qualified for it or nothing. I don't know. Bob Bryanton, that was the guy's name. He succeeded Judge Cordes, and I think he transferred over from some of the sheet metal division in Oldsmobile. But anyway, we had the interview, and I never got into the foreman training program. Well, it wasn't long after that, then, I'd put an application in for experimental assembly. Somebody had, well, at the same time, I'd grown tired of the hourly business, and I wanted to get in, so I went over to personnel and I made an application for a salary job.
Just talk with over there.
Yeah, but I can't remember. I tell you, I'm terrible at names, but not that I'm so old, that just, I never was did well with names. No, he was the head of the, salary people, personnel at that time, I think.
Fred Barrett, Bill Mahoney.
No, none of those guys. They were all, I just talked to a guy that was kind of a, and I can see him perfectly well, but I can't,
All right.
the name. Anyway, I just put my application in. I said, well, I want to get into time study because I'd had some of that in college. Just, the basic, understanding how they did time study and how it related to other aspects of business. So I put in for that, and then I put in for this, skilled trades thing at the same time. Well, I got the job on experimental assembly. I went over there and worked in engineering. That was in, I guess that would have been in '66 there where it was. And, so I went into that.
What
And,
did you do there, actually?
well, I was gonna be an experimental engine assembler and on disassembler and assembly of engines for,
Did you report to over there?
well, I was only there 6 months. And I don't even remember the foreman's name, and that would be the only one that I remember. I don't remember who the head of it was. Of course, I was an apprentice under a skilled trades program. And I got in there, and of course, at that time, that was frozen shift at night. And I was very reluctant to take it in the first place because by that time, I had young children, and they worked 10, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week at that time. They were making fabulous salaries with the overtime they were working, but you also might as well have been in jail for that because you never seen any of your family, particularly on the night shift, you know.
It's about 19.
So that would have been right up to about 50, it must have been 58 or 59. And I worked there, and I remember the foreman was quite put out because I'd just gotten to the point where I could work on my own without working with someone. And, you know, I'd learned in 6 months, learned enough, and he was just about to, big deal, assign you to a bench. You know, you had your own bench and put your own toolbox up and blah, 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 and all this stuff. And then I had the offer to go on salary in time study. And I was really reluctant to take the job because I was making so much money with the overtime in experimental engineering. In fact, I went on and at $6,000, well, it was $500 a month was the starting salary at that time.
In experimental?
In time study, which would have been 600 or 6,000 a year. But everybody in experimental engineering were making closer to 15 with all the overtime. You just worked Saturdays and Sundays and 10, 12 hours a day, and you just made tremendous amounts of money, but it was about like being in jail because you just went home to sleep and then you can't make back. But anyway, after I thought it over and I knew that I would have to work probably 8 or 10 years before I could get from permanent nights onto days, and with you know, by that time my family would have been grown and I would have never seen my kids only on Sunday mornings, you know. So I decided, well, I better take the salary job even though it's less money and probably my chances of going up was going to be better. So I went into, in first, Fred, can't say the name of the guy now, that was the head of time study at that time.
Where were they located?
They was in, I don't know now, it was 34 or 40.
Okay.
We moved back and forth several times between 34 and 40, but it was one of the two buildings. We moved in there upstairs, And, so I took that job and moved in there, and they were quite put out at the time because the starting salary was $5.25, but because I'd been in experimental engineering, my salary, my hourly base was higher. I would have, if they'd given me 500 monthly, that would have been a cut and pay for me. So they reluctantly agreed to give me $5.50 to start, because to bring me up par with what I was earning an hourly. So anyway, there was quite a lot of discussion, not with me, but among themselves, what they was going to do about it. I guess that was against company policy to promote you to a lower salary type of thing. But anyway, that's the start of that. And then when I went on salary, they needed somebody over the forge plant. One of the people who were over there they only had 2 people at the forge plant.
What does time study do?
Well, we went in and the hourly people think of it as setting production rates. In other words, going in and telling people how many pieces an hour or whatever they're doing they should make per hour. And, but it's done more, as far as the company's concerned, to establish costs on stuff. In other words, how much labor does it take to make a given part at various steps in the process. In other words, we set up a kind of a time schedule for a part from its however we bought it as a casting or as a sheet metal, and we took right from where they unloaded it off the truck, and we made a kind of a flow chart of that particular part from its when it was received at some receiving dock, right on through the system to blanking it out and forming it if it were a sheet metal part, and all the operations that was done to it and the time it took to do this thing. Now we didn't do anything with the indirect labor, all the people involved. That was another, at that time anyway, we didn't have any concern with that. But these other people, in other words, when we established the time, which was translated by accounting into some kind of money, and we did put on all of our time studies when we had to finish saying our routing of this thing, and this is what we did. We routed this part through the system. And then we put on the job classification of every person who worked on this part. Then accounting took that and translated it into so much money and they could tell you how much money it was from the part through steps A, B, and C. If they wanted to, if it, for some reason or other it was scrapped at that point, they knew exactly how much money that part cost at any step during the process. So this is one of the primary reasons. But then of course we got into dealing with the union, because we set the rates for these people. In other words, if the supervision went out and they said, well, why didn't you make your 1,000 parts today? And the guy'd say, well, I can't make 1,000 parts a day. That's where we got into negotiating with the union, and we had to kind of prove to the union that, hey, this guy can make 1,000 parts a day if he don't take 2-hour breaks, But this was our job, was to determine the labor costs, direct labor costs on every part we made or assembled at Oldsmobile.
Do you remember any peculiar situations?
Well, I remember one, and Bob Cook was the general manager then. I kind of remember it because of the last job that I did when I was still out on the floor making time studies before I was promoted to a office job, was that I was just checking a part, and we used to go through all these time studies every year to update them and make sure that they were still applied, that they hadn't been a method change or they hadn't been a part change. So if we didn't, all the new jobs we time studied, of course, originally, and then every year we'd go through all the rest of them and check them against the job on the floor to make sure that there hadn't been changes. And so I was doing this one time, and I found out that in the sheet metal finishing, the Tornado fender, previous time study fellow, had incorporated the time it took to finish a fender with a turn signal or a cornering light in it He incorporated that time into the total fender, which meant that, and there was a extra, because the extra hole in the fender, it took another half a minute to do a fender. And so I said, well, this isn't right, because cornering lights were only, I don't know what the percentage was now, 20% of the business. So we were allowing this cost on all fenders rather than on just the cornering light accessory. So I said, well, we got to change this, which meant that now the guy, instead of doing 7 fenders an hour, he had to do 8 or something like that. And we got into quite a brouhaha with the union about it. They said, well, it was your mistake, it's not our fault. And I said, well, yes, it's our mistake, but I said, the fellow is not doing the work. I mean, it's not a matter that we're adding any work to the fellow. He's not doing the work on 80% of the fenders. But anyway, it came down, and they even wrote a letter to the International Union. And they said, well, they said, if you insist on that, we'll just have to strike over a thing like that. Anyway, we ended up at Bob Cook's office and without the union. And he said, well, he says, what is the difference? And I said, well, it's about 1 fender an hour per man per day. In other words, or just for the metal finishing thing. The guy generally can do 7 fenders, and now he should be doing 8, you know. And so Bob Cook everybody was there, was quite serious and you know, thought that they had a real problem on their hands. And he said, well, you know, he says, it costs, I forget to figure now, something like $50,000 a day to shut this plant down. And he says, if this guy goes from 7 fenders to 8, he says, how long do you think that it would take to make up the $50,000? So it kind of put the problem in a little better perspective. So everybody says, well, you know, forget it. What's the use of fighting about this? And it was really a pretty small thing. And it's got to be a matter of kind of saving face with some of the people. And then I remember that always kind of Bob Cook looked at it, you know, in a practical method. That, you know, if you'd say, well, the guy's got to get 8 fenders a day, or an hour instead of 7, why you compare that to $50,000 a day to shut the plant down for 2 or 3 days. Well, it didn't amount to much. But
Who were your supervisors and foremen at that time?
Well, I worked at that time. I think I was working for Chafee. He was head of our department. Now I don't know. Of course, we worked under industrial engineering, and I can't remember who was the head of that at that time.
So time studies reported to industrial engineering.
Right, time study always was a part of industrial engineering, but we were always kind of a stepchild for a long time. We were never really, as far as if somebody came in there and they didn't ask, they would never know that they were a part of industrial engineering. We were always, even though our boss reported to somebody in industrial engineering, we had no other particular contact with them other than through our head of our department. He done whatever contact was necessary. We didn't, as individuals, even hardly communicate with industrial engineering. And then as time went on, we become closer and closer. And then finally we were at the time Walkinshaw and Leonard and these guys took over as head of time study. They brought time study in as really as an integral part of industrial engineering. But prior to that, when Chafee and Fred Lentz was the guy that was the head of the department when I went in there, and then but he was only there about a year, and then he retired, left, and then Wayne Chafee took over, and then Bob Ringenberg, he took over from Chafee, but these were kind of medieval promotions. In other words, the guy that was the next guy to the head man just kind of automatically filled his shoes, and it didn't matter whether you were qualified or not. If you were next in line, you got the promotion back then, or that's what it seemed to be anyway. They never interviewed anybody else for the job, or like I say, we were kind of our own little island. And anyway, this is the way these people were promoted, and well, this is my perception of the way they were promoted. I don't believe that they ever even considered. Then the last person, when Ringenberg retired, then we'd had upper management had changed considerably. So then they started talking to other people and said, well, this is part of industrial engineering that you'd ought to consider other people in industrial engineering as being heads of work standards. But anyway, all through this time, it wasn't, it was many, many years after I hired in the department that I was the only college graduate in the whole department. They didn't hire engineers or anybody, college graduates or anything else for time study. They wanted people who had some wide experience in more than one area in the plant to come into time study. They thought that was more valuable than formal education.
Did management really support the time studies?
Well, no, we were always a thorn in supervision side, because we in fact come in there and lowered their efficiency. In other words, they'd be operating with 30 people, and when we got done with time study, they'd find out that, hey, in order to be efficient, they'd have to get rid of 2 people. And this is a difficult job for supervision to do. They've got to operate, which means they got to switch jobs around. They just got to operate the thing more efficiently. They don't have the extra people there to if they run into trouble, they just don't have a guy there with half a job. They can say, well, go over there and help out on this job and get us straightened out and one thing or another. So there was some reluctance on the part of at least foreman level people. They didn't like to see us come into the department and start making time studies, because they immediately knew that, well, there goes my extra man. I got to get rid of him to get my efficiency. And it was generally thought of as that if they get up to the mid 90s on their efficiency, labor efficiency, that was good enough. Nobody objected to being 93% or something like that. But they'd be running 98% without much problem. Then when they had to get rid of 2 people, that they had to combine jobs, and they really had to go to work for a couple months, and they usually got grievances when they started moving these people around. And so they didn't really like to see us coming in. There was very few of them who were really had any personal vendetta against us, but they just knew that we were going to cause them extra work. It was like going to the hourly person and say, well, we want you to work another hour a day now for the same pay, and that's what the supervision felt. But they understood that we had our job to do. We didn't really have anybody that was, like I say, tried to hinder us in any way or anything. They just didn't like to see somebody coming in that was going to make their job.
We have some good names in that. I was going to ask you a question here. What did the workers do when they were being time studied? What was their response?
Well, of course, all of them immediately when they seen if he'd been there and been time studied before, or had even been in a department, the hourly people knew that when we showed up, and we used to always work usually in teams, maybe 3 people, go in, and so we could get done with one particular department sooner. If you just sent one man in one department, it would take him a month or more working in there, and it worked out well to go in there and finish up a whole department in maybe a week or 2 weeks. So we worked usually in teams of 2, 3, sometimes 4 people, and
Do you remember any of the names of the people that were doing a similar thing to yours?
oh, yeah, there was some of the people I worked with, Charlie Kuhn and Bill Mead. He was I worked with him, and then he was my supervisor for a while, quite a few years. Boy, well, I'll have to remember them as we go along. But anyway, the hourly people thought we were there. Their feeling was, oh, here's time study now. They're going to give us more work to do, and the foreman also, used us for a scapegoat. I mean, he would go in and tell the worker if he had to add some more work to him to increase his efficiency or get rid of one man and combine job, he'd say, well, I hate to do it, but time study says I've got to give you some more work. So, which didn't bother us any, because the foreman had to live with the people, and we didn't. We were in and out of there, and we didn't have to listen to all the complaining and bitching that the hourly people do. So this didn't bother me. Some of the guys, they said, well, that's the foreman's job. He shouldn't be blaming us for something that he should have done 6 months beforehand. And I said, well, what difference does it make? You don't have to deal with these people every day. Let the foreman use that excuse if he wants to, But anyway, the hourly people, and of course, immediately when you start time studying them, they'd immediately slow down whatever they were doing, but they would also start doing a lot of extra things that wasn't even included in their job. They thought that we were kind of dumb, I guess, but like I say, we'd be in a department for 2 or 3 weeks, and we were around there, and when we walked by the area, we generally worked in one area, either worked in car assembly or the engine plant or pressed metal, and we see these jobs every day when we were in the plant, and we spent 75% of our time out in the plant doing these time studies. But we knew what the job was before we stepped up there and looked at the guy. We'd stand there, we'd study the guy down the line, but we was also looking at the guy 2 or 3 jobs down, and we knew by the time we got up there what his job was. And when he started just fooling around, some of them would be so bad that we'd have to go get the foreman, and he'd have to instruct the guy. We didn't talk to the hourly people directly. We talked to them, but we couldn't tell them, well, don't do this or do that. So if they were just really messing things up, we'd go get the foreman and tell him, do his job the way he's supposed to do it. And the foreman would do this. There's no problem with that. But
do you remember any incidents when you had to get a committee name in?
Well, there were some of the hourly people that were better at doing this, of making a job look a lot more difficult than what it really was. And as you went through a department, some of the older time study people would say, well, now if you study that job over there, that guy will make it look like he's just busier than hell. But he says, you watch him, he's over there smoking and getting drinks and talking to everybody. He says he can really do that job easy. But he said, when you start timing him, he'll be the busiest guy in the plant. But I don't remember any particular people. But so the word when we went through, if you were a new man, well, you kind of wasn't given the more difficult hourly people to deal with till you got a little more experience. And then of course, as you got more experience, these people, you could see through them, immediately. And plus the fact that when you were actually working on this guy, you was also observing several other people at the same time. So when you got there to study their job, you knew whether they were trying to fake a lot of extra work or something on them. And, but we didn't have a lot of trouble with hourly people. They were overall pretty cooperative, I mean, they just took that as kind of something that they expected every year, and they didn't like it, but on the other hand, it was something that they knew was part of the company policy, and we had very few people who really objected to the process as, being unreasonable about it. Everybody So, well, the damn time study man here, because they knew that they'd probably get some more work. They didn't like the idea, but they understood what was going on. They did not always understand why. In fact, one story I always tell, and it kind of escapes some people, but just like I tried to explain to you why we did time study, and the basic thing was established labor costs. But anyway, this young, evidently some young guy out of high school, and I was working on my time study there, and he come up and he says, "What the hell are you doing this for?" And I says, "Well," and I started to go on and explain to him what all we were doing and how we established costs and blah, 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 and quite a detailed explanation of what we were doing. And he stood there a minute and he kind of thought. He says, "Well," he says, "why don't you just take the number of cars at the end of the day and total up the paychecks and divide it into there," and he says, "you'd have the same damn thing." You know. And I said, "Well," I didn't say anything then, but after I got to thinking about it, I thought to myself, that ain't a bad idea. It would save a hell of a lot of salary employees, because we had about 40 people doing this, and I said, you could just hire some high school kid to come in and do that and lay off all the time people. But anyway, you run onto a lot of characters of this thing, and I tell her about it. We had an old guy when I was working in the forge plant, and he worked right in the aisle. I don't even remember what he did now. But boy, when you walk by there, he's one of these guys. He didn't have much of a job, as I recall, or wasn't very busy. And anybody that went by there, you couldn't get by him when he come right out and put his arm around you. And he was quite a big man, but he didn't have any teeth. And of course, it was very noisy in the forge plant. And so in the process of talking to you, kind of spit on you. He used to get so I'd go around. I wouldn't go down his aisle because you always got stopped for 10 minutes, and he'd tell you all the bad things going on with his job and why he thought I'd ought to come down time study and lower his production and all. But there was a lot of characters on hourly that just would pester you on being a time study man. They'd come down and they'd say, "Oh, well," they'd come down and they'd say, "Well, the damn foreman give me something else to do today. You better bring your watch down and time it." He had time to come over and tell you about all this, but he didn't have time to do his job, type of thing. And of course, he didn't realize this, and so you had to say, "Well, yeah, we'll be down there. We'll be down as soon as somebody calls us." You just kind of tried to pacify the guy, get away from him, rather than listen to all this stuff. But,
what were working conditions?
Pardon?
What were working conditions? I know you mentioned the forge plant was so noisy.
Well, yeah, the forge was noisy, and of course it was also dirty. There was a lot of smoke and one thing and another there, and that was before you wore any ear protection, and of course I'm quite hard of hearing now, because working in the forge plant, I kind of blame that, because I immediately after working, I started out and I worked there 5 years, which would have made me total at fault. But in that 5 years, I could notice a deterioration in my hearing because it was so noisy and the thing of it.
So you spent 5 years in the forge
I
plant?
spent 5 years, my first 5 years on time study in the forge plant, and it was just really noisy in there. And at that time, they made no effort to try to lower the noise levels. And the noise levels wasn't so much in the hammer shops where the forge presses were going. That was relatively quiet, but where they used to clean these things, and the shot blast machines where they were tumbling all these parts and one thing and another. And then the truckers would bring these big guns of castings over and dump it into a metal hopper. Oh boy, and that was so noisy, it made somebody, it was actually painful. It would hurt your ears, if you were standing here and the trucker all of a sudden behind you would come up there and dump a whole gun of connecting rods in a metal hopper. Boy, that'd just bring you right up on your toes, it just felt like somebody had your head in a vice there for a few seconds. So everybody there, but.
Was Steve Valk over there when you worked over there?
Yeah.
Did you work with Corbin?
Did I? No, he was supervisor, but I didn't have anything much to do with him. I worked in his department, but.
It was in the 60s that you were in Forge plant?
Pardon? Yeah, that was in the early sixties. I went over there, not because I knew anything about forgings, but at that time, when they started out with the F-85, they built the, front end, suspension assembly over there. And because I had experience in car assembly on time study, they sent me over there to help the forge plant time study men who weren't experienced in assembly time study methods. I went over there and kind of worked in that, and the other fellow that was in there was, fellow I worked with was Stan Larson. And, he knew all about forgings, but he didn't know much about, car assembly or assembly operations of any kind. So I went over there and on that, and then, of course, that was not a full year's job, time studying that thing. There's only about, I think, 100 people involved with that front end assembly that they made for the F-85 and the Pontiac, I don't know what the Pontiac car, the same size car that they started at that time.
Who was the forge plant manager, do you recall?
Corbin, Elmer Corbin, and, the fellow, of course, I didn't deal with, at that time, we didn't do much with Elmer Corbin, although Elmer Corbin as a plant superintendent was closer, I think, to, people at my level, which is a 5 level, than a lot of the other superintendents. So Elmer was very, common sort of person, and he got more involved at lower levels of supervision than what a lot of the plant superintendents did. It was a kind of a little, clique over there in the forge plant where all the supervisors knew everybody, and, there wasn't as much of a dividing line between levels of supervision there was at the main plant. So if you had a problem, you could just, anybody that was, well, even hourly people could walk in Elmer Corbin's office at any time. There was no problem with, accessibility with him. You didn't have to stand on any formality to get in to see any of the upper supervision.
What about safety? Situations dealing with safety?
No, safety was always something that, as long as I was there, all safety was pretty well enforced, and nobody had any. They used to be. I worked a little bit in press metal, and some of the people used to there occasionally try to shortcut some of the safety things, guards, and use their hands where they should have been using tongs and that sort of thing. But even the other workers, they'd see somebody over there and he'd be trying to maybe working without tongs or something. They'd start hollering at him, say, "Hey, you better get them tongs up." And they enforced it. If they caught somebody deliberately bypassing safety methods or equipment, they would give them, lay them right off on the spot, give them a reprimand with a day or two layoff. They didn't tolerate any deliberate safety, violations. And, they never had any, people that objected to it either. Like I say, it was later on when they come in with this OSHA business that, they had to have, or they wouldn't even let you have, you couldn't even reach into a machine with, even a pair of tongs. They went down to there and Oldsmobile spent millions and millions of dollars on some sort of a loading system where you'd put your parts in a fixture, and then you'd move the fixture in the machine, and the thing was supposed to drop the part on whatever it was. And so you didn't even have to get your hands anywhere near the machine. They spent millions with this, interpreting these OSHA laws. And they didn't even get through that model year. And then they went in and, well, none of these, or many of them didn't work. They probably would have cut, in a lot of places, would cut production in the whole group by half or something if they had to use all these things they designed. And then they kept, of course, trying to improve all these loaders that they designed that didn't work well. And then before the year was out, they reinterpreted some of these OSHA standards and said they just took all these expensive fixtures that they'd made and worked on for 6 months and just took them, threw them away, and went back to the old methods.
Remember what year?
Well, no, but you could find the, like I say, when the first year that OSHA came in and started really, pushing for these safety standards. And they just went completely overboard on it. That, like I say, Oldsmobile, as I recall, they never asked me, or I don't think they ever asked anybody to do anything that was deliberately unsafe. In other words, if you had to put your hands in a potential pinch point or anything, they always had either tongs or these vacuum lifters or some kind of a tool so that you didn't have to work with your hands in a dangerous place where there's danger of getting your hand caught or anything like that. And all your machinery had lockouts on them. Now, some of the people didn't always use these. Because if you had a 30-second job to do, like changing a tool, a drill bit or something, and you had to walk 100 feet over to an electric panel and put a padlock on it and come back and do a 30-second job and then walk clear back over there. A lot of times people didn't do that. They shut the machine off, but they wouldn't put their padlock on because it just, well, it was just a shortcut that way. But most of them did throw the switch on the electric panel, but they wouldn't get their padlock out, put on it for just a small thing like that. Now, if you're going to be down for 15 or 20 minutes, then you would. But for a less than a minute delay or job on a machine where you just pulled the lever down and done your job, and then you flipped the electricity back on and done it. But Oldsmobile's instructions were for you, if you were going to work on a machine that had a potential of being started from a remote area from where you were working, which these big long machines in the engine plant did. In other words, the power source might be 100 feet from where you were working on the machine. Their strict directives was, and if the safety person come along and found you doing it, they would give you a written reprimand for that. But people didn't do that always. But anyway, Oldsmobile directors always were quite specific. Is don't do anything that you're at risk at. And most everybody, 99% of the people, followed these things and were glad to have, just like eyeglasses, safety glasses. People would come in there that had never worn glasses. Oh, I hate these damn things. I hate these damn things. But after they were around a while and seen that people did get stuff, broke their glasses and stuff with occasionally, then they knew that, hey, this is necessary to wear safety glasses. But there was very little objection to any of the safety practices, and they were always, like I say, I worked all over the plant, and I never see anybody really fighting safety that much, either salary or hourly,
Safety shoes too.
Safety shoes, yeah, they'd always have, well, every department usually would have a set of shoes set up somewhere where they'd flatten them, somebody dropped something on their foot and ruin the safety shoe that it saved someone's foot, or like I say, they'd have eyeglasses up or were broken where they'd saved someone's eye. So it didn't take long, even though a guy that safety glasses used to be original big objection, because somebody come in there that was 19 years old, had perfect vision, didn't like to wear safety glasses. But like I say, after they got in there and seen the potential for accidents, they soon got over their reluctance to wear safety glasses. One of the things that I always kind of got me was, I don't know why I remember this, but they used to, wherever there was a place to sit down in the plant, like they put a safety railing up along a machine or along the aisle to, just keep the traffic away from equipment or something. People would sit on these things during their break or for lunch or something. And at that time, if there was a place where people would go along there and sit, loiter, or whatever they call it, they'd hire the welder to come out and weld spikes on these things so people couldn't sit there and loiter on these things. And that went from that type of attitude of people into the fact where now they put in the lunch rooms and the TVs and all that. And I thought, well, that's quite, I'm never quite sure whether that was progress or not, but somewhere in the middle, I think it was good, but I don't, I never really felt that they needed TVs for in the plant for a person to eat a sandwich by. But anyway, that was one of the progressions of attitude for hourly people while I was there. In fact, they used to go along and where there was a nice place to sit down for 5 minutes, they'd weld spikes on it to putting in, these lunch area, with lunch areas all right, but I never quite understood the TVs.
Let me ask you, Dick, about things, breaks. You mentioned the breaks that people have, the elderly people, how did that work?
When I first started there, and for many years, you got 12 minutes twice a day.
Could you take your own time on, I mean, determine when you were gonna take your?
No, most of the time you had a relief person come along and you didn't take a break till the relief person got there to relieve you. And then you had 12 minutes, then that went up to, that went from 12 to, seemed like it was, what, 24 minutes a day. And, I think that went up to half an hour where you got, no, it went more than that. It must have went up to 46 minutes. You got two 23-minute breaks. I can't remember. It was quite late. It was for many years. It was always 24 minutes a day relief.
That'd be after the tornado?
No, yeah, it was after the tornado plant was gone out of there. That was the kind of the start of this. They give them 23-minute relief, and then about the same time or within a year or two of that, that's when they went in and they gave you, or they gave hourly, well, they give salary people the same thing. They give them this extra few days or a year off with pay for, I forget what they call it, like sick pay. If you could call you, they give you so many days off for illness with pay. In other words, 6 days. I think it was originally 6 days a year, and then that went up to this 10 or 12. And that, of course, that ended in the year 1982, the year that I retired. I was due to retire, and they came out. They'd had a bad year that year, and then Smith, one of the president of the corporation, said, "Well, we're going to do away with it." So they went away with those, what they call them, ST days, and they done away with that and cut our vacations in half. So I was due to retire March 1st. My last day was January 6th or something. So then they said, no, they cut half your vacation, went from 5 weeks to 2.5, and you lost your 10 ST days. So then I had to work till middle of February before I could retire. Well, then I talked to somebody in personnel, and I said, well, just move my retirement date ahead. Instead of retiring March 1st, I'll retire February 1st or whatever those lost days done. And they said, well, we hate to do that. We don't want to go through all that paperwork. Why don't you just work that extra 3.5 weeks? Well, of course, on salary, and I had quite an involved job at that time.
What were you doing?
Well, I was a supervisor in time study. And
your office was
yeah,
located?
I had 6 people that I supervised, time study people.
Where physically were you located?
We were in building 40 at that time.
Supervisor.
Huh? No, I worked with Ron, but I never supervised Ron. No,
That's all right.
no, anyway, the people I were supervising were newer people we had a lot of turnover at that time because we'd had quite a few retirees in the years before, and B, yeah, was one of them. But, anyway, I had to kind of turn my job over to my successor, and I'd accomplished that. I was all ready to go. I don't have.
Who was your successor?
I think Gary Gross took over from me, and I don't know. Gary is Gary worked directly for Jim Walkinshaw for several years after that. But anyway, yeah, Gary was the fellow who was going to take over my job. And, you just kind of pass the reins over, and you'd already accomplished this. And then they said, well, we just want you to, we don't want to have to go through all this paperwork. So I said, I had made no immediate plans on, I said, if it's easier, I'll stay another 3.5 weeks. So anyway, I stayed there because of this thing. Well, I stayed there about 3 or 4 weeks, and then they come around one day and said, well, you're all through. They reinstated the 2.5 weeks vacation. So by that time, I'd already worked about 10 days into that 2.5 weeks. And, so I said, fine. And I remember we'd already made, arrangements to, rent a place here in this park. So I got on the phone, right then I got on the phone and called down here and I said, well, I said, they changed my retirement plans again. I said, can we get in a couple of weeks early? No, yeah, I said, the place is empty. You can come down anytime. So anyway, I called her and I said, well, get ready. I said, I'm gonna finish up here tomorrow. I said, we'll be on our way. But anyway, that's whenever those ST days started, why that was when they increased the relief time and all the plan. But that was kind of something that really didn't do a lot of good. I mean, it's something the union got in there, and where they needed a little more than 12 minutes, they didn't need 23 minutes twice a day. People didn't know what to do with themselves for 23 minutes. You know, you go to the bathroom and you eat a sandwich and have a cup of coffee, and then you just don't have anything to do for the next 5 or 6 minutes. So that's when everybody started carrying these paperback books around in their pocket. They had so much relief time that they started reading to fill up their relief time. They didn't need that. They needed more, but they didn't need that much more. And this kind of one of those overkill situations when I got into that.
Did they also have a lunch break?
Yeah, that's outside of lunch. Of course, they didn't
Yeah.
get paid for lunch. These other things they got paid
They
for.
did.
And then there were some places where they didn't have relief people. It just meant that these people, where they just got their production, they had a production quota that they made, and they could usually by working excessively fast, and we always asked them to work at a normal pace. We didn't want a guy to work, and sometimes you would have the foreman tell them to slow down a little bit. Women were particularly likely to do this. They get nervous when we were time studying. Boy, they'd be working, and we knew that they couldn't maintain a pace this fast. And we'd say, you know, just we know you're working faster than you normally do. Work at a normal pace. Well, I don't know. I'm nervous. You're standing there watching me, and so we told them to do that. But that wasn't too many cases of that where we had to tell a person to slow down. But it did happen.
As
And-
you worked through, did you see more women in the plant?
Yeah. When I first started there were a few older women that working there that were still there,
What were they doing?
mostly in car assembly. There were a few in the motor plant
What
on the,
did they do in car assembly?
any of the jobs. They just,
Name a few.
there were a lot of them assembling the, instrument panel. They had, putting all the little screws and clocks and speedo assemblies in the instrument panel.
Okay.
That was lightweight. They went out of their way at that time to give women light jobs. They didn't think that women could do any job where they had to lift a 6 or 8 pound part. They didn't figure they could hold up under that. So they give them quite easy jobs at that time, but they also gave them jobs. Women were more dexterous with their hands, so they gave them jobs where they had a lot of little screws or a little fussy work to do. Men didn't like those jobs, so women kind of just automatically drifted into those jobs. Women liked that kind of work and men didn't, so that's where the women kind of just fit into them. They wasn't a real conscious effort to get them into there. That just, people kind of float into jobs they like and then they stay there. There wasn't much, as far as labor, I don't know what you'd call it. People, hired people, didn't have much sense of, at that time or any time, of look at a person and talk to a person. They never seemed to be able to fit the person to the job. And I still don't think they do a very good job at that. And one of the jokes at the Forge plant is when they hired in a 6-footer, they always gave him a job on a machine that it was a low machine. He always had to kind of work in a stoop position. Even the person my height would have to stoop over to do it. They said they always had 6-footers on these jobs, and then the other jobs are up here, they put little short guys on that. And this is, this is like one of the objections that they had, that they'd send some guy that weighed about 100 pounds over to work on a heavy job, and the 200 pounders, they'd give them the job trying to put in a little tiny screw. I don't think this is conscious effort, but when you've seen people working in those conditions, you always kind of wondered why they didn't put more effort into finding jobs that fit people's, at least their physical abilities better than what they did, you know. And,
But later then women got into jobs that required more physical.
right, and as time went on, they were less, and as there was more women come in, they just couldn't be as selective on the jobs they put them on. And let's face it, a healthy woman can do handling 5 or 6 pound part. There's no more effort for them than it is a man. But I think there's probably still jobs that women just physically couldn't do in the shop. But of course, there are fewer and fewer as you get into more automation and